Currently, there's exactly one word you need to say to induce nightmarish feelings in any Smite player that's not an ADC main, and that is Failnot. This item is generally recognized as the strongest release of the most recent patch in terms of items. Of course, there are some other items that are also strong and some items that may be a little more situationally strong, but the overall consistent performance of Failnot has not gone unnoticed. There are various different build options for Failnot, there are different ways to utilize it, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We're not going to rant about this item today just yet. We'll do that soon enough, I'm pretty sure, but we're just going to talk about it from a perspective of how good is it really and how can you use it. Different from usual, we are going to look at the item quickly first, but then we're going to look at the possible builds and talk about what ways there are to use this item, and then we're going to look at some more numbers heavy stuff. So switching the order around a little bit from the standard. There's also going to be some hidden skin codes, by the way, for Biohacker Kali. So briefly, if you've been living under a rock or you haven't played the newest patch yet, a quick rundown of the stats of Failnot. The item is part of the new Gem of Fate item tree that focuses on cooldown reduction and some effects on the tier 3 items that somehow interact with ultimate usage. In Failnot's case, you have a price tag of 2,800 gold, 20% cooldown reduction, 45 physical power, 25% critical strike chance, and yes, there's no mistakes here, these stats are actually this high. And when you finish casting your ultimate, the next ability or basic attack within 8 seconds that damages an enemy marks them, increasing the chance that you and your allies land a critical strike by 15% for 10 seconds. Yes, that means Crit Ymir is actually back. Your allies, your magical allies, can crit through this item. This effect can happen once every 45 seconds, basically every time you ult, depending on how much your cooldown reduction is and which card you're playing. This, stat-wise, is basically some blend of Deathbringer and Rage. You have an overall higher physical power than Deathbringer and the same critical strike chance, and on the other hand you have the same critical strike chance while your passive is active as you have with Rage, and a much higher power too. In other words, the power and crit chance alone are pretty insane, the price tag is relatively low considering that, and then you also get 20% cooldown reduction on top of that. The item was, I think, as far as I understand it, intended as a kind of a gap closer for ability hunters that would like to utilize some crit in their builds. Unfortunately, this item is now a must build for pretty much all hunters. Sure, you can still choose not to build it, but in most situations that just means you're going to lose out in most trades, because you get so much crit chance from this and so much raw power and cooldown reduction that there aren't that many items that can really hold their ground against that and that many item combinations. Maybe if you're playing an ability based hunter and you got ahead before the enemy got this item and you can utilize the gold lead and the enemy is just playing some late game hunter, then you can possibly somehow outplay them, but then you could still just get the item and win all the same, so really not much of a reason not to get it. And with that, let's talk about builds that can be used or are typically used. The first one is the classic standard, so to speak, that starts with Hunter's Blessing into Devourer's Gauntlet into Ninja Tabi, which is the build that you use on most ADCs nowadays, really. After that, you would typically either go into some mixed DPS option, mixed damage option, or you would sometimes go into Executioner right away if you were playing full on for late game. With this, you will not do that. You will go into Failnot after Ninja Tabi in almost all cases. That is because Failnot has such good stats at this point of the game. It gives you CDR, which is very useful here still because your abilities still do a lot. It gives you a lot of power, and it already gives you crit chance, and not too little of that either. It's worth noting that in this context, the best single crit item until this patch was not Deathbringer something, it was Rage. And Failnot is just a stronger Rage, so it's just crazy in terms of DPS output at this point, as well as ability damage output, so it really has everything you want, and then you just build Executioner afterwards, and then you build your Deathbringer, and then 6th slot is whatever, or in other words, 6th slot is what we'll talk about later. Could be, for example, Wind Demon, could be Malice, could be Odysseus Bow. But before we get to the efficiency aspect, let's talk about the other variations. Some of them were already discussed in other videos by other people. I think, for example, Zapman brought some up, and I think Frost brought some up. The main one here being a Transcendence build. That is Transcendence into Ninja Tabai into Failnot, bringing you to a lot of power and also to 30% cooldown reduction already. And then you go into Executioner, and then you could opt into Deathbringer, and 6 slot can again be very depending on the situation, many things. Another option that was proposed was Transcendence into Ninja Tabai into Asi and then Failnot. This is nice because it adds sustain, especially for those ability-based hunters that don't have built-in sustain. But I will say that I am not the biggest fan of it right now, because the moment the enemy gets Failnot, it feels like you're gonna get slapped around even if you have Asi. So I would actually in many situations prefer to have Failnot before have Asi, and just Asi in the 4th slot and Execution in the 5th slot, or even later for Asi, and then get Deathbringer afterwards. With Failnot being effective as a single crit item, we can also fit it into completely ability-based builds. We could do it in a build where we build Transcendence into Warrior Tabai, into Failnot, into Titan's Bane, then Crusher, and then Hydra's Lament. Not necessarily all in that order, but get the idea here. You get 40% cooldown reduction, you have a decent amount of power, you get your penetration still through Crusher and Titan's Bane, and the amplified basics are gonna hit even harder if you have sufficient abilities to keep this up through Hydra's Lament. So this is something you can definitely consider with a guy like Uller, because you don't really wanna have more CDR through like Jotun's Wrath in this build, because then you'd end up with overcapping CDR due to 20% cooldown reduction on Failnot, which is ridiculous to begin with. And then last but not least, we can also fit Failnot into more hybrid DPS builds that don't rely on crit. So a build where you start with either Transcendence or Devourer's Gauntlet, mostly dependent on the hunter here, into Ninja Tabai, and then into Failnot, and then into something like Executioner, Kin-Size Asi, or Executioner Kin-Size Crusher, or Executioner Crusher Kin-Size, depending on how exactly you want to go about it. But you know, a DPS-oriented option that still has a lot of ability damage, and through Failnot still throws in some crit as well. It's by all standards a very jumbled up mixed build, but with Failnot that's still okay. It works in all circumstances to some degree. Of course, the best situation to use a crit item is typically in a double crit build, but that doesn't mean that the other options here don't work. But speaking of working, let's get into the actual numbers and see what we can find out. So we're not going to go through all of these builds here, but rather some variations, and especially look towards the late game options to see what you want to build around the first extra crit item after Failnot and the second one. So this is going to be tested on Hachiman level 20, just our average hunter basically, and somebody who makes very good use of this item. What we're going to have first is basically our classic old 5 item / 5.5 item build, being Hunter's Blessing into Devourer's Gauntlet, Ninja Tabi, Rage, Executioner, and Deathbringer in whichever order. So this is what you would have built for crit beforehand in many situations, not always of course, but in terms of raw DPS, this is usually the way to go. There are variations when you're behind, there are other variations if you just prefer other path, but this is an overall one that is easy to compare to, and will also give us a better idea of how much better Failnot makes this build. I'm not going to go through every single stat we have here, but the outcome that we have is our DPS at the end, before any protections, which won't matter because the pen item here will always be Executioner, is 1025. And now we can take the same build and switch out Rage for Failnot. In that case, our DPS is 996, so we lose a little bit here. But that's just until we actually have the passive after using the ultimate, at which point the crit chance of Failnot will increase to the same level as Rage, and then our DPS is suddenly 1114 against one target that is marked. So a 29 DPS loss on one hand for normal trades, which is really not too bad, and most fights happen around the time where you use your ultimate, versus an almost 100 DPS gain when your passive is active. Next, I figured we always kind of tend to try out every crit item with Deathbringer first, but maybe in this case, if we throw together Failnot and Rage, we'll actually end up with more DPS because we get such a high crit chance. That is actually not the case. The DPS under normal circumstances is now 933, and after ulting it is 1018, so it remains a little bit behind the other options here. So it's pretty clear that you eventually reach a point where you just don't benefit that much from just getting more crit anymore, and a stronger crit multiplier, a little bit more power, does more for your DPS. It's also worth noting that this version is also weaker for ability damage. Then I figured, what if we throw in an activated Wind Demon instead? That one actually comes a little bit closer. The DPS without the ultimate passive is 981, and with the passive it's 1082. And this is without Deathbringer, so this is pretty interesting. What does this mean exactly? You lose some ability damage. That has to be something that's clear to you here, because you lose a little bit of power. You gain some attack speed instead, so meaning if you are not as good at hitting your shots, then that can help you a little bit, because you have a little bit consistent extra attack speed, and then once Wind Demon's passive activates, you get even more attack speed. I assume that Wind Demon's passive is activated here. There are situations where it's not, of course. If you didn't crit once, then the DPS will drop a little bit here. But with such high crit chances in general, typically these should be your DPS values. And then what's also very important is that this version gives you 20% extra movement speed once Wind Demon's passive is active. And that's while the Deathbringer variation doesn't give you anything extra. And 20% movement speed, in my opinion, can be very, very strong and should not be undervalued. So it depends a little bit on the god, it depends a little bit on how you're playing the god. But overall, I would say, especially for those of you who don't typically play that much ADC, this may be the better path, just going for Failnot plus Wind Demon instead of Deathbringer, because you have a little bit more option to juke around and not rely as much on a single crit, because you have a few more shots that you're firing as well. And then to quickly break down the level 20 variations as well, the first one that I tried was Deathbringer, Devour's Gauntlet, Ninja Tabi, Failnot, Executioner, and Wind Demon. So basically just adding Wind Demon or Deathbringer, depending on which one you build first, to the build that we had before. And that brings us to 1243 DPS before the passive and 1370 DPS with the passive after the ultimate. Pretty high numbers. I also tested 2 builds with Odysseus Bow. Unfortunately, they don't really come close in DPS output. You have around 1100 HDPS, and then you add Odysseus Bow for an extra roughly 100, but overall you don't quite get to where the pure crit build gets. On the other hand, you obviously have to keep in mind that with Odysseus Bow, while you lose some ability damage as well, you often have the chance for multiple bounces of the effect, and the moment you get multiple bounces, the damage output here is drastically increased, though in this particular build, it's not as heavily increased as in more pen-focused builds. But if you want another more raw damage-oriented option, another one that I tried was basically the same build as the first one, but instead of using Wind Demon, I used Malice and Deathbringer. That is because I really like Malice's passive on certain hunters, and Ataraxia pointed this out actually, but Malice's effect is especially strong on hunters where your steroid goes on cooldown the moment you use it, which is for example the case with Jing Wei, and that makes for a very interesting combination because you can use your steroid so much more often, which can often result in actually higher DPS output regardless of what the stats say here. And this comes pretty close already. We have 1133 DPS before the passive is active, and then 1245 DPS when it's active, but we also only have 1.76 attack speed, whereas other builds go up to 2.06 here. Meaning if we play one of those ADCs where the steroid immediately goes on cooldown and the Malice reduction can start proccing right away, the DPS increase that you can get out of that is pretty massive. It would in that case probably outclass all other combinations here, and you have to keep in mind that it also gives you more utility, more escape potential, more CC potential and all that. I didn't test the Transcendence variations in this case, but the outcome should be pretty much the same as with the Devourers ones, because the power doesn't seem to be the main value where things hinge on with most of these builds. I think this is overall very interesting, and I think the results show us that there's a lot of possibility for variation to some degree still in these kinds of builds, but at the same time I absolutely think that Failnot does need nerfs, and we'll talk more about that in the future if these numbers didn't show that enough. With that, thank you guys for watching. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell, and here's me out. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to hit the like button, and other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.